Alrighty, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's weather chat. I'm meteorologist Timmy Albertson here with you guys. Well, if you remember, on Thursday night we were tracking quite a bit in the way of some severe storms across parts of Ohio and back into southern Illinois. For the most part, most of those damage surveys are pretty much done. Still waiting on a few more details on a couple of them, but all things considered, at this point, it's kind of safe to take a little bit of a look at the map there, and we'll take a look at some of those tornadoes. Now, also, we could be seeing late season snowfall across some parts of the upper Midwest later on this week. So some much needed snowfall around where I am. But we'll get to that here in just a moment. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look here over at the survey map here. Now, this is from the National Weather Service office. You can access this at home for those of you who want to take more of a little bit of an in-depth look at it. And as mentioned, we did see quite a bit in the way of some tornado activity across parts of southern Illinois, going back into, well, not too far away from the Louisville area. Most of the tornado activity, though, is back out across Ohio. And then the day before, we were tracking a couple of nice little storms out in Kansas. And as a matter of fact, we'll start off with those two. For those of you who might have watched the weather chat from Thursday, or not Thursday, excuse me, Wednesday, we were taking a look at a couple of little tornadoes down across parts of eastern Kansas near the Topeka area. And one of them looked very, very well on the radar. This was it right here, the one that looked pretty good there on the radar imagery that we spent probably a good 5-10 minutes ogling over its radar returns there. But again, this was its path, generally out in the open areas, but there was enough to find some EF2 damage, and that was ultimately what it was rated at. That same storm would then go and produce yet another little tornado over across, well, once you go over I-70 there, kind of still out in the rural areas, but still also an EF2 tornado. Then we saw kind of a Boeing line push its way across parts of the Midwest during the overnight hours and into the early morning. That did spawn a couple little brief spin-up tornadoes in some areas. However, the biggest tornado, ironically, from that line actually happened a little after noon on Thursday. On Thursday, before our main event, we had kind of what's called a tail end storm there on the line that ended up producing an EF2 tornado. Now, with that in mind, this was its path right here. Touchdown just outside of Hanover, producing some little damage here, and then tracked its way, producing some EF1 damage, and then over the Ohio River into areas just south of Madison, and then crossed back over the Ohio River, where just north of Carrollton, ended up producing a little bit more in the way of some EF2 damage. Again, we can see that tornado kind of widen out a little bit as this damage path made its way through the town there. We have these little triangles here in case you're wondering. I talked about these before, about the damage indicators and what is used when it comes to rating tornadoes using the damage and everything. And this is kind of a good visualization. For example, you click on this data point, it'll tell you kind of what it was here, the type of damage, what it was, its degree of damage, and of course, this being a photo of what ultimately ended up being some of that damage there. So again, this was used partly of the survey, some EF2 tornado damage there with that storm. So again, kind of cool there, nonetheless, to see that just a little bit. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and kind of back up a little bit, and we'll take a look again at our good friends here, the damage map. So that was kind of like the pre-show. Well, I guess technically you consider Kansas's activity kind of the pre-show, but this was the pre-game show, I guess you could say, is this little guy that made its way down here. Things then quieted down across Ohio for a little bit, but then we saw some more storms pop up, and those storms ended up producing some tornadoes. Now, we were tracking a lot in the way of storms, and this is kind of interesting because I know a lot of times when we talk about tornado outbreaks and you hear about all those tornadoes, you tend to kind of think that they happened all over the place and that every single storm was dropping a tornado. And sometimes that is the case, as in the super outbreak of 74, and then again in 2011, pretty much every storm that day decided it wanted to drop a tornado. But generally, what we end up seeing in these types of situations is we get a couple of supercell thunderstorms that end up dropping multiple tornadoes, some of which are strong. And again, Good example of that tends to be those outbreaks out in Oklahoma a lot of times. The May 3rd outbreak back in '99 was kind of a good example of that. You had a handful of storms, but they dropped quite a few tornadoes each, and one of them dropped an F5 tornado, which ended up, at least for now, was still the strongest tornado on record. But in this case, that's kind of what we saw here. We had about three supercell thunderstorms that we were really tracking, and again, the main one that we really followed was this middle guy right here, as this one was a very long supercell or a very long-lived supercell, and it produced quite a few long track tornadoes. Now, there's also another one further up towards the north, not quite as strong, but it did produce a little tornado in southern Hancock County, a little bit of some wind damage just to the east there of Findlay, Ohio, and then it produced this EF2 tornado back over here. Now, if you remember from our live coverage, this was the one that initially was reported to be about a half-mile wide. I don't think it ended up being quite that. It was a little bit narrower than that, but still, it was an EF2 tornado. Stayed mainly over rural areas, but again, there was enough damage indicators that we could get a pretty good idea of what was going on. So, with that in mind, let's take a look here at the big one. So this was the main one that we were tracking. It first decided to produce a little tornado just west of Salina, Ohio. And Salina just happens to sometimes be one of those towns that just attracts tornadoes. Van Wert is another one in Ohio that just seems to attract tornadoes. But Salina, or Mercer County at least, I guess I should say. So anyways, so the first tornado that was produced, not a very strong one, but still a pretty decent one nonetheless. It was an EF1 tornado. Here is its path. You can see it kind of touched down, widened up a little bit here, produced some EF1 damage, generally out in some rural areas here, and then continuing to just produce some EF0 damage on its track. It began to kind of shrink as it eventually began to weaken, but it still held out all the way to State Route Ohio Highway 118 there, pretty much out in the rural areas. Now, could this tornado have maybe been a bit stronger? It's totally possible. But again, remember, if there's no damage, we don't know. We can't give it a rating in that situation. Again, this is a primarily rural area, so aside from maybe a few little structures here and there, sometimes some of these structures, for those of you who are familiar with agriculture, some of these structures can get destroyed in 80-mile-an-hour winds. So if it gets destroyed at 80 miles an hour wind, but we can't find anything, that might suggest stronger winds, well, you get the idea. Kind of gets that 80 mile an hour rating instead. Again, obviously, some other factors go into this too, but that's pretty much the main one is the damage. And again, sometimes it's actually very fascinating in meteorology. There are debates sometimes over whether something should have been counted as slightly more damage or not. The Joplin tornado had a good argument about that. The Tuscaloosa tornado had a good argument about that, and of course, obviously, the El Reno tornado, which was originally thought to be an EF5, ended up getting an EF3 rating because there was no or there was not there was no higher damage than EF3 that was found, even though we had some measurements that would have suggested otherwise. But again, for consistency, that's the way the rules are followed. You don't like them, but that's at least how things are now. That tornado then lifted, but if you remember, there was a point where we thought maybe this might have been one tornado, but it looks like based on the damage surveys is that the damage didn't continue. We lost that signature of a tornado over these rural areas just to the west of Salina. However, we then saw a new tornado touchdown over Salina. And this little guy touched down right here, down outside of downtown, and then kind of quickly widened up here, tracked its way just to the north of the small lake here, and began to kind of widen out a little bit, producing kind of some EF1 damage yet again. This tornado then stayed on the ground for quite a while, and we were tracking it as it was moving north of St. Mary's, and it was actually beginning to approach Wapakoneta. I believe at this point they actually did issue a tornado emergency just under the assumption that if this thing continued, it would go straight into Wapakoneta. But what we then saw was the circulation not only began to weaken, but the mesocyclone actually looked like it began to move a little bit further to the south, and we saw kind of a new area, low level rotation developing just south of Wapakoneta. So it kind of skipped a little bit here. Now, tornado likely are obviously pretty much lifted, so there was no tornado on the ground, but then we saw that new area of rotation develop quickly. We were watching it, it happened in just about two radar scans or so. That new rotation developed quickly, and we did actually have a video that Michael had shared with us that he found on Twitter of this thing touching down. And this was the one that we were taking a look at. It kind of had that uh, somewhat angled looking rotation, which is generally a good indication that it is a strong tornado. This one ended up being rated an EF3, and it was on the higher side of the EF scale rating. And we've taken a look before at what the EF rating is. We'll pull that table up here. Well, actually, maybe we should see if we should just do that now really quickly here. For those of you who might not be familiar with the enhanced Vegeta scale, this is it right here. Again, it uses damage to rate the tornado. It's on a scale of 0 to 5. Again, 0 being the weakest, 5 being the strongest, and again, we use we use the damage to estimate the win. So again, if there's no damage, we can't estimate the wins with it. So when we start talking about EF2s, those tend to be considered significant tornadoes. When we start getting above EF3, those are very major tornadoes, and EF4s and higher are violent tornadoes. Those are the big ones that you see that often are on the ground for a long time or produce the most prolific damage. Typically, you get high-end EF4 to EF5 damage. I mean, typically you see things for the most part kind of obliterated, more or less. And sometimes these guys can have winds of over 200 miles an hour. And that's happened quite a few times to some of these tornadoes. Anyways, that's what we're talking about here on our scale. Again, there's a minimum wind speed and a maximum wind speed. Either way, just keep in mind, this is mainly, just for categorization purposes in meteorology. We like to categorize everything. So, with that in mind, that thing touched down. We saw the video, and this thing quickly jumped up to an EF3 here. So we got our little damage here, and this orange section right here that you see, that's where the EF3 damage was found again, kind of right at the edge of this little community here. And again, if we take a look at some of the damage, there was trees debarked with stubs stubs of the largest branches remaining. Again, debarking of a tree. So when the bark is taken off the tree. So again, that tends to be a high-end type of tornado situation. Typically, you don't see your EF0s doing that. And again, these are damage indicators, all right? Again, damage text, tree, hardwood, and we have a whole scale for types of damage that can be, types of hardwood tree damage. There's a whole list of stuff that we look for when it comes to that. So again, from there, we can kind of get an estimate as to where the winds were. So that's how all this is done. Same thing back here. Other damage, not quite sure what that one categorized would have been, but let's see here, same thing. And then going back up here, again, another hardwood tree type of situation. So again, EF3 tornado there, winds, in this case, at least at this particular point, we're estimated about 140 miles an hour, which puts it right in the middle of that rating. Now we can see here, once it left that town, you'll notice how that orange kind of dropped off a little bit. Again, part of the reasoning for that might have been because there was just no damage to really find. That might have suggested anything higher than EF2. You see where we're going with this. Now, again, mind you, tornadoes can also oscillate in their intensities. It's not unusual to see them, produce, EF4 damage and drop down to EF2 and then go back up to EF4. It happens. But in this case, just kind of interesting there how the EF3 damage was really just limited to this little community here in not too far outside of Wapakoneta, north of, what was that town again? Not Watkins, but Jackson Center, way northwest of Jackson Center. All right. This tornado then stayed on the ground, ladies and gentlemen, producing a little bit of damage here out in the rural areas. And then we saw it really begin to intensify yet again as it approached the Indian Lake area. And that's where the strongest of the damage was found. You can see here all the damage indicators really kind of lighting up. Again, it did hit a kind of a mobile home park or at least a camping site. So while it might have, been totally devastated, doesn't necessarily mean that as tornado is what you would see, is what you saw back in '99 with the Moore, Oklahoma tornado, or the 2013 Moore, Oklahoma tornado, or the 2003 Moore, Oklahoma tornado. Moore, Oklahoma is another place that attracts tornadoes. Anyways, you can see the damage path for this thing. This guy really did kind of widen out a bit, and you can see here almost about a half-mile wide at one point, and that damage just kind of continued on. Again, hit the community of Russell's Point, just out there on the south side of Indian Lake, and then it returned back over rural areas, began to narrow out, and eventually we did see it weaken off a little bit. Now, that wasn't the end of the excitement for this supercell, as this guy ended up producing yet another tornado when we don't have yet the damage width path here with this one. Again, there is still some discussion that maybe these two might have been the same tornado. Regardless of the fact it happened north of Marysville, Marysville. EF2 tornado pretty much tracked all across Union County and then into parts of western Delaware County. This is a very populated area. Here's the city of Columbus, Franklin County, all this, and then Delaware County, again, where a lot of the suburbs of the Columbus metro are. We then were watching on the radar as that same storm looked like it was producing yet another tornado, but albeit the signature not quite as strong on the rotation, but still enough that it was likely a tornado. And lo and behold, it ended up being actually a tornado. It touched down just south of Delaware, Ohio, which is a pretty big suburb. It was on the ground for quite a while. It had a maximum width of about 1,800 feet, and this was an EF1, maximum wind about 110 miles an hour. So, again, this guy was on the ground for quite a while too, passing just to the north of Newark, Ohio. So again, that one supercell produced one, two, three, four, five tornadoes at least. But maybe there's still some thinking that this might still be possibly the same tornado, but we'll have to kind of wait for that. So that was the main one. Fun times. All right, let's take a look here. The biggest one of the outbreak ended up being one that passed north of Selma, Indiana, and then made its way into Union City. And by biggest, I'm talking it by about 5 miles an hour. This thing was a borderline EF4 tornado. And right now it looks like they weren't able to find any EF4 damage, but it was certainly very close to that. It touched down just outside of Muncie in the little town here of Selma. So if you were going down the interstate here, you would have had a really good view of it when it first touched down. And this thing immediately started producing some damage up to about EF2 intensity and Selma. It tracked south of Parker City, south of Farmland, and then made its way into Winchester. All right, where it produced quite a bit of damage, mainly EF2 damage, but there were a few EF3 damage kind of indicators there. This guy continued on the ground as we were tracking it, and then it skipped National Weather. It's jumped to another National Weather Service office. So this was all the Indiana office, the Indianapolis office, and then it jumped into the Wilmington, Ohio office. So that's why we see a little bit of a change here in the appearance of this line. The same trail just happened to cross the division line here, and it mainly produced EF2 damage as it tracked its way south of Union City into, this part here of Ohio, continuing its way through, passing north of Greenville, going through Adams Township, and then dissipating right before Piqua, Ohio, right off of I-75 there. So again, another long track tornado. Other tornadoes that did occur during this event, again, mainly happened down around the St. Louis area, a couple little EF0 tornadoes there, a few little short-lived things here and there, and that's pretty much, in this little EF2 tornado that happened down in rural Arkansas. But otherwise, for the majority of the activity, it was focused in on Ohio, and you can kind of just see those little lines there, signifying where those tornadoes were. We'll keep an eye on it to see if there's any conclusion with this right here, but for right now, that's looking to be the way that things are standing. So, let's talk about the current weather right now. Alrighty, everyone. Well, we have an area of high pressure across the Canadian prairies right now that is doing its best to try to keep temperatures a little bit seasonal, even somewhat below average in some areas. Much needed, given how boring and snowless our winter has been. Frontal boundary extends all the way now across parts of the mid-Atlantic, going into the upland south, and then stalling out across Oklahoma, where it then goes back up to the north there as a stationary front. Now, what we're eventually going to be seeing here as we go into the next couple of days is we're going to watch as a new area of low pressure will develop out in this area, and it's going to track its way to the south and to the east, and in doing so, it's going to be bringing some rain across parts of the deep south, but it could be bringing some snow across parts of the upper Midwest in the order of a couple of inches, which is certainly needed. Now, again, March 20th, they were going to be talking about March 21st and 22nd. As weird as that might sound for some of you, believe it or not, some of the biggest snowstorms tend to happen that time of the year. There's some reasoning behind it, but we'll go into that tonight. But we're not expecting that. But certainly a couple of inches much needed, and that might help to make it at least not as snowless of a winter. All right, let's take a look here at our good friend, one of the forecast models. We'll kind of take a little bit of a look at this system here. So again, they're good friends here. Take a look. We can see that area of low pressure making its way out of British Columbia into southern Alberta as we head into tomorrow morning. That low will then kind of weaken off a little bit, but we'll see a new area of low pressure developing right around the Wyoming, South Dakota border, maybe in northeastern Nebraska. You can see the moisture trapped with this high pressure up to the north, kind of squeezing this moisture through, and it's going to track its way across central Minnesota back into northern Wisconsin, probably producing a couple of inches of snow in those areas, maybe upwards of about 2 to 4 inches, or maybe even 3 to 6 inches around the Minneapolis area, depending upon how things set up. Then we'll see that system kind of begin to taper down a little bit as it begins to interact with yet another system further down to the south. And then we could be seeing yet another system trying to develop as we head towards the end of the weekend. And that guy could also be bringing some snow across parts of the upper Midwest. So looking like we may have some active weather, some active winter weather finally across some parts of the country. So with that in mind, we'll take more of a look at that forecast for the day tomorrow. But in the meantime, that'll do it for us tonight. And as always, keep enjoying that weather.